How to give professional answers to Nvidia's top 7 interview questions. Question number 1, tell me about yourself. So no surprise, this is the most commonly asked interview question in job interviews with pretty much any company nowadays, at least in the US. And the best way you'd want to answer this would be to have a one sentence of introduction, something interesting about you, then follow with 2-3 key achievements, something that's the most interesting about you, something memorable ideally, and then you would want to close with your motivation for the role. Some of the best answers to tell me about yourself are motivational ones. So people who can speak well, people who can build a motivational speech, they would give by far the best answers. However, in my experience, 90% of candidates would greatly benefit by focusing on clarity of thought while delivering their elevator pitch. The second most commonly asked interview question with Nvidia is, why do you want to work at Nvidia, or why this role? What motivates you to join our company? And here, in order to save you a bit of time, I would highly recommend you prepare this together with the tell me about yourself, because maybe you've noticed that the last section of tell me about yourself can actually be the motivation for joining them. How do you answer the motivation part? Well, you'd maybe want to link to Nvidia's core values, which I'm also going to talk about next. Maybe you'd want to find some other interesting motivators. Maybe you had some colleagues who joined Nvidia, or maybe you have someone who recommended you from Nvidia. Maybe you're fascinated about the scale of Nvidia, or maybe you have some technology that sounds quite interesting for you. All right, so this would be the top 2 most commonly asked questions. Now, for the remaining 5 questions, I would like to highlight that Nvidia pays particular attention to screening candidates based on their core values. So therefore, since they have 5 core values, I'm going to pick one question from each. So beginning with innovation. Okay, so how would they screen someone on innovation in their job interviews? They actually have a rubric that they have to fill in. Hey, do you agree that this candidate scores well on innovation on a scale, let's say 1 to 5? I'm not sure about their scales and this stuff. So what's a representative question here? For example, tell me about your most recent invention. Okay, so the vast majority of candidates would answer this interview question, what's your most recent invention, with something they think they invented last week or in the past 2 weeks, let's say. And this is a classic scenario of delivering good versus great interview answers, because if you prepare these things in advance, especially the innovation, you would read this interview question of tell me about what's your most recent invention to something more on the lines, what's the best invention you can sell yourself on during this job interview. Of course, in a professional context, of course, related to your subject matter expertise, right? So the moment you read a little bit between the lines, you know what exactly they're looking for. You know that they're interested. Hey, what do you want us to remember about you in terms of innovation? Okay, the second thing I like to talk about here, the second core value with respect to speed and agility. Okay, so a representative question to score someone on speed would be to how do you prioritize under pressure? Okay, so you had to deliver something under pressure. Now, this is a behavioral interview question as well as the previous ones. And a behavioral question means that they look at your past experiences as a predictor of success in your future job. You'll probably know by now that the best way to answer these behavioral questions is using the STAR format. Okay, situation and task, action, results. Now, for example, if you would be speaking about a prioritization under pressure, maybe 2 weeks before a major release, you had a problem that prevented you to release certain product or service or solution. And your task was obviously to fix that. And you would talk about the actions that you took And in the end, you manage to deliver on that successfully. This would be the classic star format. Now, what happens in the age of AI, expectations have evolved. Okay, so if you would give this templated, rather static example, that will be perceived fine, but not as great as when compared to if you dramatize a little bit the situation, or you give a little bit more context here. For example, the fact that something went wrong 2 weeks before your release, this puts testing at risk of cost overrun of 50%. Okay, so the customer had to pay 50% more because some system didn't work as expected, and you have to prepare for that. Okay, so by dramatizing things at first, by mixing the situation and task from the star format with a challenge, you automatically would score more points when it comes to the impact of your interview answer. Similarly, after speaking about the results, you managed to deliver that something on time, you maybe would want to also add a bit of learnings, okay, and maybe a forward-looking statement, to exhibit a little bit more positivity in your answers throughout your job interviews. Anyway, so these are the basics that I wanted to share with you here to give you some guidance as to how to best answer these, or at least how to professionally answer these interview questions. Okay, the fourth core value I want to talk about here would be intellectual honesty. It was actually the third. So intellectual honesty, how would you screen someone on intellectual honesty during job interviews? Tell me about the time when you failed. Okay, so when you ask people about failure, you'll be surprised how well can you read a candidate, especially a candidate who did not prepare for their job interview. Some candidates will block, they will not admit, some candidates will not admit that they had any failures in their careers. They would use something very insignificant, would say, don't worry, it wasn't really a failure, but I have to answer your interview question, let's move on. Right now, the best candidates who obviously, ideally, you prepare these things in advance, the failure questions, you would speak about the genuine failure, and you would pitch yourself, and you would sell yourself, so to speak, on your failure by its learnings. So if you remember the STAR format, 50% of your STAR answer, the action and results, would be the learnings. Okay, and if you prepare for these things, you'll notice that the more you think about your learnings, the better your story, the better your pitch will sound to this interview question. So going back to intellectual honesty, this is how you screen people. This is how you screen candidates on core values in these job interviews. Core value number 4, excellence. Okay, so excellence. How do you screen someone on excellence, on whether someone has high standards in job interviews? The best question I know about this, which is slightly a trick question, is tell me about the time when your program, project, or solution was already receiving good customer feedback, but you decided to do more. Okay, so an easy interview question for most candidates. It's rare for someone to block on this interview question. What happens is that most candidates would answer this interview question with a genuine situation when something was working reasonably well, and because it was not working perfectly, they wanted to fix that for their customer so that it worked better. Right? Now, what candidates with high standards would answer this question would be more on the lines of the product or service was working well, and that they thought of improving it with something that the customer didn't even know was possible. So they basically wowed their customer. So this is how you exhibit high standards and excellence in the type of work you deliver, and this is how you sell yourself on high standards in these job interviews. And finally, one team together would be the last core value with Nvidia, and this is about your ability to work in teams. And Probably the most representative interview question for this would be, how do you handle conflict inside your team? And this is a very common interview question, one of the most common behavioral interview questions out there, and it still works to screen candidates simply because the expectations differ by the level and the type of role you're applying for. The classic example is that an executive or a senior manager would answer a question around conflict with a story of influence, how they influenced something in the context of a conflict. Maybe you influenced a decision of adoption of a technology inside your unit or organization. Maybe you influenced something with the customer, while more juniors, so to speak, roles or technical roles would resolve conflicts by proving their point using data and communication. For example, when you have a conflict with your manager, you have to prove your point by using data and using communication in order to gain your manager's trust. Okay. Also, these conflict questions can be quite representative as the type of role you're applying for. Hands-off roles would rather answer this with influence. Hands-on roles would rather answer this with data, with a data-driven approach and the trust pitch. Right, so this would be the top 7 questions to prepare for NVIDIA's interviews. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.